This is Legislatures, the Inside Story, and I'm your host, Tim Story, the CEO of the National Conference of State Legislatures. Several million of our fellow citizens have answered the call of public service and make their career working in local, state, and federal government. They are dedicated to making sure that the programs adopted by legislatures at all levels of government are well run and serve the needs of all Americans. Their roles, so often behind the scenes, are crucial enough that Congress created the National Academy of Public Administration, NAPA. NAPA is committed to excellence in governance at all levels and promoting ways for all public servants to be their best. We're going to learn more about that today with my guest. Terry Gerton, President and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration, NAPA. I'm so glad that you could join me today to be on the podcast. Thank you.
Tim, I am delighted to be here, and I'm also delighted to congratulate you on your recent election as a fellow of NAPA. Welcome to the fellowship.
I am a new fellow of NAPA and pretty excited about that. I see so much potential in it, and that's one of the big things we're going to talk about. I want legislators, legislative staff, and others who follow along at home here on the Inside Story podcast to learn about NAPA. Let's lay the foundation right there. So tell us about your role and what is NAPA and what is my discount on auto parts now that I'm a fellow? That's the big question.
I actually have a picture in my office that says NAPA, we don't do wine or auto parts. So I can't help you with that.
I'll bet you've heard that joke about 1,000 times, and I was reluctant to use it, but because of that. So I love that you've heard it so many times. You've pre-planned with a sign, like stop it with the NAPA jokes. What is NAPA, the real NAPA? Tell us about that.
The National Academy of Public Administration is one of only two congressionally chartered national academies. You know about the National Academy of Science, but NAPA is its sister organization. We were created in 1967. By James Webb, who at that point was the administrator of NASA, who said, I know where to go for my scientific expertise. I go to the National Academy of Sciences, but I'm starting up a new organization here. Where do I go for public administration expertise? There is no equivalent organization. So he got together with some of his buddies and created NAPA. And it was largely, at that point, convened out of past presidents of the American Society for Public Administration, ASPA. So they got together and they created the organization and began to bring in experts on public administration. And that group then pushed through with Congress a congressional charter in 1984. So NAPA was created in 1967, but not chartered by Congress until 1984. And our congressional charter specifically tells us that we're supposed to be responsive to government agencies at all levels of government around issues of public administration. And so we do that predominantly through the fellowship of the Academy. People like you with long careers of excellent service in public administration are nominated and elected into fellowship with the Academy. So this is not like a one-year student fellowship or it's not a visiting fellowship. Once you get elected, in theory, you're a fellow for the rest of your life. And we bring the expertise of our fellows to our government clients through contractual fee-for-service arrangements predominantly. But for a minute, let me brag on our fellowship because we have nearly 1,000 fellows, and they come from the entire cross-section of public administration. So about a third of them are or have been professional academics, folks who are doing leading edge research in universities, who are deans of schools of public administration, who really bring to us the latest thinking around best practices in public administration. We have about a third who are or were practitioners at the federal level. So senior executives in career federal service or political appointees with long tenures in government who've led every cabinet agency, managed budgets, worked on the Hill, really know how the federal government process works. And the other third are state and local practitioners. So we have some former governors, we have city managers, county managers, folks who are in state and local government in all of its different manifestations. And that is what makes the National Academy of Public Administration really unique. So when you're looking at whether or not a grant program is effective or who should be in charge of a program that several different agencies or levels are responsible for, NAPA is the only good government organization that really looks at that from the intergovernmental perspective, thinking about all of the stakeholders that are engaged there, and brings the latest academic research to that construct as well. Typically, our work is, here's a problem. What should I do about that? We don't try to just diagnose the problem or say, yep, that's a problem, but rather, not only is it a problem, but here's what the latest thinking, the best practices tell us is the solution set for that problem. So that's the quick elevator pitch on NAPA.
Quick, and I'm pretty sure you have barely scratched the surface of what you do. This is not meant to be a pop quiz trap by any stretch of the imagination, but my question is, do you have any very rough estimate of how many Americans currently have a career in the public sector, in public administration? We would call public servants. Like, how many people do that?
Not enough. First of all, at the federal government level, we talk about 2.5 million civilians work for the federal government in all of its different characteristics. And the people who study the federal workforce say even that's an undercount because of all the folks in contracted services, consultants, all of those kinds of folks that also support the federal government. I think the latest number I heard about state and local government was like another 3 to 4 million. So you think all of that together, 6.5 to 7 million actually on government payrolls, plus some other number of folks who are busy providing contractual services to the government. That is not enough to do the things we ask government to do.
At the legislative side of things, I see a very sort of niche world of public service. There are roughly 25,000 full-time legislative staff, not counting the 7,386 elected officials. And then there's about another 10,000 who are temporary. They'll come in for the session. So it's a tiny fraction of the public service. Of course, these, especially the elected officials, are constantly thinking about these state workforces, who technically work for the executive branch and the governor, but, are often very closely intertwined with legislative directives and statutory guidance. So I think for, if you're a state legislator listening to this or a legislative staff director, the question is, what are the big challenges right now in public sector world? I have a pretty good idea. You've already alluded to one when you said not enough. There's definitely a lot of discussion inside legislatures about their own staffs. And then certainly among legislators about state employees, state workforces, a lot of gnashing of teeth. There's a great deal of turnover, and it's given the labor market, next to impossible to fill the jobs with qualified people. So is that one of the big challenges, and what are the other challenges right now for public administration?
Well, certainly the workforce is a big one, and we think about it not just in terms of numbers, but in capacity, right? Do you have the capacity in your government to deliver the goods and services and benefits programs that you are expecting that government to deliver? As an example, we talk a lot about grants management, and at the federal level, these billions and trillions of dollars that are coming out through new legislation around infrastructure investment, the ARPA Recovery Act, the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Recovery Act, all of those are pushing billions of dollars to the states. Well, if your state government workforce doesn't have the capacity or the people who know how to receive those grants, process those grants, account for those grants, compete for those grants where they have to be competed for, your state government is not going to receive the additional benefits of all of those programs. So like a very straightforward place is to say, do I have the capacity to manage the grant money and the investment money that my state could have access to? That flows right on down to communities, right? Big cities typically have large grant staffs. They know how to apply for those. They're very competitive. But a little town of $25,000 or 25,000 people probably doesn't have a grant writer on staff, whereas that town might really need money in the Infrastructure Investment Act to put into their water system, right? if you don't have the capacity to execute that function of government, your community or your state may be missing out on tremendous resources that could benefit all of your constituents, all of your population. So that's it's not a small one. We can't expect government to be free, right? Especially when it comes to people. In the same kind of way, investment in IT is a huge challenge for governments at all levels. I don't even want to hazard a guess as to how many federal IT systems are still on COBOL and Fortran. It's the number's not zero, right? And yet our funding systems tend not to be organized to allow us to make capital investments, right? They're organized to allow us to pay for expenses as we incur them, but to transition major IT systems, whether that's data collection, funds distribution, the topic du jour is the IRS's systems, which are still so heavily paper oriented. We have to make conscious investments in that kind of technology infrastructure to have government be able to deliver the kind of services that we expect it to deliver for the residents in our communities. So those are just a couple of resource questions. But the other thing that I think we're finding is, regardless of the question that you ask about government, right? You could ask climate change, you could ask roads and rails, you could ask equity and justice, you could ask election management. None of those problems sits alone, right? In these days, every single problem in public governance and management is a multi-sector, multi-level, multidisciplinary solution set. And if we're not careful, the natural inclination of our system is to silo. So I think the biggest challenge that we have at every level of government is giving ourselves and the people who work for us the flexibility to get all the right people at a table, a virtual table or a physical table, to really design system-wide solutions to the challenges that we have ahead.
I'm fond of a saying, and I can't remember who said it now, that great leaders are great simplifiers. The more you can simplify these overwhelming, daunting problems, the better off you'll be in terms of not getting people to step forward, go on offense against these things. Do you ever worry that things are just too complex now? I mean, you didn't even mention cybersecurity in IT systems, and everything seems to always point to a resources problem. Like, we need more resources, right? And then that's such a difficult starting point.
I think these are hard and complex problems, and we shouldn't try to make them too simple, but I think there's kind of a simple approach to them. Think about who's affected by this program, and are you listening to their voice? Think about who owns or has control of any of the inputs into this process, and are they at the table? Make sure that you don't fall subject to the "we've always done it that way" problem. Do you have the courage to say, yeah, but it's not working anymore, and is there a better way to do it? So voice of the customer, cross-agency stakeholder collaboration, new ways of moving, and then try and test, right? So kind of what I've outlined there are some things that we've been researching and publishing in our Agile Government Center, where you take the concepts of Agile software design and you transition them to management. And they're really helpful, right? Do you understand the mission? Do you understand who your customer, your client is and what they want? Do you understand who else you need to talk to find a solution set? And then start trying and testing. Another great management saying is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Try something, get something going, do it in 120-day sprints, come back and say, well, that worked. Let's build, or that didn't work. Let's change. Even though the problems are complex, that to me gives you a framework of starting to bite off progress at solutions.
What advice do you give to legislators and legislative leaders who, their ultimate pressure points are the elections themselves and the constituents who are coming to them and saying, I want you to do everything, but whatever you do, don't raise my taxes, cut the other person's priority so you can fund my priority. When you think about public administration and the challenges, how do you counsel elected officials who have those cross currents?
Well, that is a great question. And it's a line of conversation that we've been trying with some federal legislators for a while, which is before you pass another law about any program, stop. And let's go back to say, what is this? What do you want this program to do? Right? What is the outcome that you are seeking? Is it smoother rail transportation? Is it better water systems? Is it new services to communities that have been left behind? What is the outcome of the legislation? And now let's think about how we can optimize the amount of resources that you're about to appropriate that goes to outcomes and not to overhead. I'm just talking legislative programs as opposed to other pieces, but what we've done for a long time is write legislation that is very specific about compliance and not very specific about outcomes. And one of the pieces of work that we did early in COVID was to look at the CARES Act, which actually pushed money out to states with very little oversight regulation.
Oh, we were lobbying hard for that. Actually, that would be sort of that was our preference.
But we had members of Congress going, we're not really comfortable with this, and we want somebody to come back and tell us whether the flexibility was the right thing to do. And we would say yes. We were able to articulate so many cases where states and communities got very innovative and really created all kinds of new solution sets that served their residents in the way that the law was intended, that the funds were intended, and that really reduced the amount of oversight, reporting, special IT systems, all this other kind of stuff. If I could give just one piece of advice, it would be to legislate in a way that focuses on outcomes. We'll take care of the accountability of the process, but we don't need to specify that at the level of detail we have in the past, and make more of those resources available to deliver the programmatic outcomes. That's how you get better outcomes without raising taxes.
So we also know that particularly the nature of the media in the United States, is that for all of those great programs and flexibility and innovation that happened under the CARES Act or under the COVID, the first COVID, there were four COVID packages, and then inflation, and then the infrastructure bill too is in there. For all those stories, there's the one story of the dog park that got built next to the mayor's, because the mayor has three dogs, and there's those stories that just seem inevitable, right? But there's this strongly embedded in American culture perception of government, of public workers, of government workers. As someone who is maybe the spokesperson for all of public administration, not to give you too much pressure there, how do you answer those folks? Because I know legislators think about those things.
You're right, and there's no easy answer for that. The most productive response is have your counterpoint ready, which was, you're right, it cost us $50,000 and that dog park did get built, but we saved $500,000 of your money by not having to report at this level of detail. And that $500,000 went here. Or you're right, we do have three people to plant one tree and you could do it for one. But those three people also take care of safety. They make sure that you don't cut a utility line. They make sure that the trees don't go on the wrong side of the property line, right? So you're never going to get away from that one failure story. But if you have the flip side story to tell, over time, the success story outweighs the mistake story.
Is that something that Napa does, is try to tell those stories?
We do. We try to tell the stories about people who are out there doing great things in their communities. We have a weekly podcast where we feature a lot of our fellows who are out doing amazing things, especially related to our grand challenge. And we try to tell their stories as well. Like, how'd you get into public administration? Why do you keep doing it? What is the benefit? Why do you stay with it? Personally, for me, they're incredibly heartwarming. I know most of these folks and their stories are just amazing, but the average person may not know why, a city manager stays doing that kind of work, or how they engage their city council with their community to really make sure that they're addressing those solutions. So we do that. We have daily newsletters that go out that kind of highlight success stories and the news in public administration. And in many of our studies, we try to put forward examples of where great things are happening, because there is a lot of good work going on. And I'm talking to a fellow public administrator, but the people who are doing this work are so compelled by it. They want to do good for their community, for the people they live and work with. They're oftentimes frustrated by the system, but they're always trying to make it work for the communities that they serve. And that's a really a powerful place to be.
Well, that seems like the obvious segue to the question of, what about you, Terry Gerton? How did you find yourself as someone who is in such a key role and cares so much about the general good and serving the public? How did you get here?
Well, my typical answer is divine intervention, because no one would have ever plotted my course if you'd set out to do it. Really, my exposure to public service started when I went to West Point, which I did because I knew that I needed a job and I didn't know what else I wanted to do. And I would get a free 4-year education and a 5-year job. Service in the military and the community engagement that entails, in the service ethos that kind of gets bonded into you, was hard to leave behind. So when I retired after 20 years, I joined the career civil service in the Department of Defense. And I did that for about 8.5 years. And then I tried consulting for a little while. I was probably a failed consultant, but I learned a lot in that process. I came back as a political appointee in the Department of Labor, working on veteran employment right after the Great Recession, when veteran employment was tending towards 13 to 15%. And that was, first of all, an amazing learning experience, but second of all, something I'm really proud of, and what we were able to do systemically to change the processes by which veterans transitioned into civilian opportunities. And by the time I left, veteran unemployment was below the national unemployment average, and it stayed there even through COVID. It makes me feel like the systems we put in place held. And from there, I was fortunate enough to come to Napa and to get engaged there in a different level of service and engagement. So it's really been a lovely career path. Every job I've had, I've thoroughly enjoyed, but it's not one that anyone would ever pick out of a planning book.
There's a lot to talk about there. What is this remarkable success? I mean, almost a legacy of being part of the veterans unemployment issue. Because, I mean, I know you can never declare permanent success, but it would seem as if there's a lot of very black and white data that this is a success story. This is something that, some resources were put into, emphasis was placed on, and we can now say that there's been tremendous progress on that. I hope you take pride in that. You should.
Well, I do. And it gets back to the question you asked me before, like, how do people solve these problems? Well, it took getting the Department of Defense, the Veterans Administration, and the Department of Labor to the table with the state workforces, with employers, to understand what was happening, with community colleges, to understand how they could bring credentialing to the fore. I mean, it took all kinds of different people. It took Congress to pass legislation that every separating service member should go through a transition training program so that they would at least be exposed to the resources that were available to them. And it takes perpetual attention to the process, because it's easy to say, well, veteran unemployment is now 3%. We've solved that problem. We don't need that program anymore. We still need that program because 200,000 people leave service every year.
Well, what was your job in the Army? Just curious. I assume you were in the Army?
I did. I started off as a maintenance officer, which my husband would scoff at today.
Because you don't do all the maintenance on the vehicles? Is that the thing?
I do not do the maintenance on the vehicle, but I started as a maintenance officer, and then I took on a secondary specialty in resource management. And then when I got out and became a civilian, that was where I focused and became comptroller and looked at resourcing strategies and those sorts of things.
And then it gets to again to this notion of public service, because I think we all somewhat assume that you could take those skills, you could be a consultant. There are more transactionally lucrative jobs that people can pursue. But why does the public service? Why should it draw people? Why should people do that when it may affect how much they take home and how much they have at the for retirement?
My graduate work was in economics, so we would talk about non-monetary compensation here, right? That the feeling that you get of doing good. You can do good in lots of ways, in lots of small organizations and big organizations, but you cannot affect the lives of your fellow citizens for good at the scale you can when you are engaged in government, right? And so if you want to make a difference, if you want to be engaged in the work of serving others so that their outcomes are better, there's no place to do it where you can have more impact than public service, right? In government. And I think that's a challenge we have right now for the new generations, right? They're very public service motivated, but they don't associate that opportunity with government employment. And so there's a huge communications opportunity for all of us to better tell the story about how service in government is an incredible way to support your fellow human beings.
I see that, by the way, back in legislature world, getting talented, qualified people to agree to run for public office. It is not lucrative, generally at the state level. The intangible, the relational benefits that come from that are often very negative in many ways. The negative perception and what they have to go through, from detractors and some of the evil bile that they get from the other side comes from both sides, by the way. So I think this question of calling people to public service is really important. We've got to have to articulate that, as I think you've done a pretty nice job here. Let me ask you this: you've had the good fortune to be around great public administrators. Obviously, the academy is filled with close to 1,000 of the elite public administrators in the nation. Who are the heroes in your mind? Who are the people that stand out, that have influenced you, that have said things or done things that really left a lasting impression? People you want to emulate.
That is such a hard question because I remember the very first fellow meeting that I went to when I became the president of NAPA, and there was an individual there who was literally a rocket scientist at the beginning of NASA, right, figuring out how to do all of that. Former comptroller, of the United States, head of GAO. There were so many people around the table, and I was just like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm sitting here having lunch with people whose names are in public administration textbooks." One person who has just an amazing story across his life is Dwight Inc. Right? If you haven't heard of Dwight Inc., he just passed away last year, just before his 100th birthday. He served 7 sitting presidents. He was the federal coordinator of response to the Alaska earthquake back in the 60s. He worked on nuclear response. He worked on the Civil Service Reform Act. He just had this amazing career at the highest levels. Nobody knows his name, right? If you're outside of the public administration space, you wouldn't know Dwight Inc. He was this amazingly humble human being, and yet he left such a legacy of public service impact. He started in city management and worked his way up to the federal level, and I think he really exemplifies the characteristics that we want in our public service, right? Humility, concern for other people, an understanding of the mechanisms of government and how to leverage them to get outcomes for people that matter, and a lifetime commitment to that service. So Dwight would be like the exemplar for me of what a lifetime of public service is all about.
You touched on those characteristics, those traits, those skills. But let's say you're telling your new group of interns, when you step away from this world, retire, win the lottery, whatever you do, you want to be Dwight Inc. What was his essence that they should emulate, that they should strive for?
I just think a natural concern for other people, and a willingness to work hard to make their lives better. And I'll say only this in addition, our fellowship is amazingly long lived. Like our oldest fellow right now is 102. Dwight passed away just before he was 100. We have a number of fellows in their 90s. They've been at this for a long time. They are not stepping back. And I think so much of that longevity is a function of their intellectual curiosity. They never stop engaging in their community, in the world around them. They're interested in what's happening and how to make it better. I mean, they're at our meetings offering solutions. And very seldom is it, well, back when I was doing that job, it's like, here's what's happening now. And here's how lessons can be learned. And here's how solutions can be developed. And that is the manifestation of the ethos. Staying engaged, never getting tired of the battle to do better when it comes to government.
You highlighted intellectual curiosity, and sort of maybe there's a tie to longevity in this world as well, right? If you're committed to something that matters beyond yourself, and you are constantly sort of seeking to learn and expand that knowledge, that island that you are on, and making the coastline bigger. The more you learn, the bigger the coastline gets. I like that metaphor of an island and knowledge. That maybe there's something to that's a key to success. It's a key to being a legend that people recall and say like, hey, let me tell you about somebody that fits this. I mean, you must have served under all kinds of leaders with titles, commanders, and all that kind of thing. Is there any leadership trait that you think is key to success, as sort of shifting from sort of the public administration, which are all leaders in their own ways? But I'm just thinking about, what is the consummate leader? What image does that bring to mind?
I think that the one leadership trait that I've seen matter the most is transparent communication. It's one I've always tried to practice as well. It never helps to deny, right? That doesn't help to deny that there's a problem. It doesn't help to deny responsibility. It always helps to acknowledge whatever it is you're working on and accept responsibility. And it always helps to be very transparent about what you're doing to fix the problem and to report back on those fixes. And whenever I've worked for a leader who's practiced those basic communication tenets, I mean, what comes through is courage. What comes through is care for the workforce and the organization. What comes through is commitment to the values of the organization. Because to be transparently communicative means you have to set aside your own pride and ego and focus on the welfare of your organization. And when you do that, the people who work for you pick it up. They pick up that ethos, they pick up the values, they build trust with that leader, and they're willing to do things if that leader asks that they wouldn't for someone who didn't exhibit care and commitment and transparency. So for me, I think that's the most important feature because it embodies all of the rest.
We talk on this podcast a lot about institutions. At the core of our mission at NCSL is the institution of the legislative body, of the people's voice, cornerstone democracy, Article 1 of the Constitution, and all other state constitutions as well. So this is music to my ears. I think to lead these institutions, you have to be committed to the institution and believe in it, something much bigger than yourself, and then practice this notion of transparent communication. So I hope some people hear that and take that to heart. We should probably wrap up, Terry. What a terrific privilege for me to talk to you, and I, as is often the case, this conversation could go on for far longer. Any last thoughts for our elected and legislative staff out there who are doing their best to elevate public service?
Well, Tim, I want to thank you for the opportunity to join you today. It has been a lot of fun. For folks who are at the state legislature level, I think, again, just focusing on what really is of benefit to your constituents, right? And how can the programs that you are passing legislation around have greater impact? Think about that as you design legislation. The institutions are important and threatened, and we need to be careful about how we look at them for the future if we want democracy to survive. Federalism's a wonderful thing, and every level has its role to play. We all have a role in protecting the institution.
Those are terrific words, because it is, at the end of the day, it's about the people of our states, of our country, by the people, of the people, for the people, and you got to put that spotlight right back to that core, serving others. I am grateful and appreciative for what you do, and excited about being part of your organization as well. And thanks for your leadership, Terry. Hopefully, we'll continue this another time. But thank you so much.
Well, Tim, thank you again, and thank you for NCSL's support of NAPA's work.
I'm Tim Story, and I've been talking with Terry Gerton, President and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration. Thanks for joining me on Legislatures, The Inside Story.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. We encourage you to review and rate NCSL podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Pocket Casts, Stitcher, or Spotify. We also encourage you to check out our other podcasts, Our American States, and the special series, Building Democracy.